It seemed to me as I was listening to Lizzie that she was living every moment of the story again in her head, even as she was telling it. But the effort had been too much, and had clearly left her feeling exhausted. She lay her head back on her pillow and was silent for a while. Maybe that's enough for now, Lizzie, I told her, getting up to go and encouraging Carl to do the same. You can tell us the rest another time. Tomorrow, maybe. Come along, Carl. I could see Carl was not at all pleased with me. He didn't argue as such, but he darted me one of his darkest looks. Stay, she whispered, holding out her hand. Please, let him stay. You want to know what Muddy's secret was, don't you, Carly? And now is the right moment to tell you. It is better today because tomorrow will be too late. Tomorrow it will not be the 13th of February anymore. That's why I must tell you what happened now. It's the anniversary, you see. There is a time for these things. And besides, she went on, looking at me a little mischievously and meaningfully too. Besides, as you know, for someone my age, tomorrow may never come. Sooner or later, we all run out of tomorrows. This is true, I think, no? Don't talk like that, I said, knowing full well I was beaten. You've got plenty of tomorrow left. Now, are you quite sure you're not too tired? I will be tired when my story is finished, dear, and not before, she replied. All right, then, I told her. We'll stay, but only if you drink some more water for me. Is it a deal? I was only half joking, and she knew it. Your mother, Carly, Lizzie said with a smile. She is a most excellent nurse, and I'm sure she's an excellent mother, too, but she can be rather bossy sometimes. Am I right? Yep, Carl replied, nodding vigorously and grinning triumphantly all over his face. It is a deal, Lizzie said, and she drank a few more delicate sips before dabbing her lips with her sheet and settling back onto her pillows. It is strange, she began. We were so preoccupied, I think, by the ordinary things in life that after a while I didn't give much thought to Muddy's mysterious idea. I did ask her about it once or twice, and she said she was working on it. I certainly did not forget her warnings about the bombers that might soon be coming, nor about the armies closing in on us from all sides. How could I? I just tried my hardest not to think about it. Looking back, it is hard to believe now that I wasn't terrified all of the time, but I wasn't. Life went on as normal. Carly and I went to school as normal, when there was enough coal to heat the place, that is. There was homework to do and test. People walked and talked in the streets as usual. The trams rattled by as usual. I couldn't forget the war, of course not, none of us could. But I suppose we all just had to put it in the back of our minds and get on with living each day, getting through as best we could. Maybe that was the only way of keeping our hopes alive, by looking beyond all we were seeing around us in the shadow of disaster that hung over us. I hoped so hard that Muddy was right, prayed every night that all would be well, that in a few days the war would be over, that the bombers would not come, that I would look down the street one morning and see Pappy come walking home, and I would run to him and he would hold me in his arms again. And when the spring came, we would all go see Uncle Manfred and Aunt Lottie down on the farm, and we would be friends as we were before. And Carly and I would sleep in the treehouse and watch the moon riding through the clouds, and everything would be just as I remembered it, just as it should be. The snow came, as it has today, and of course little Carly loved that. He was the only one at school who could juggle snowballs. We went sledding in the park, built a snowman in the garden, threw snowballs at one another on the way to and from school, and the whole city seemed to be sleeping silently under its blanket of snow. The pipes froze, we froze. It was the coldest winter I'd ever known. Very soon, the snow was not so much fun anymore. It just made life more wretched for everyone, particularly for the refugees in the street. Every day now I would see them in their hundreds outside the soup kitchens, lining up in the snow or huddled together against the cold in the doorways, the children crying, and the war dragged on miserably, interminably. My 16th birthday was on the 9th of February, 1945, a day I shall never forget, and not because I had lots of presents or lots of friends to the house for a party. There was no money for that, and besides, no one was in the mood to celebrate anything. Muddy and Carly had made me a birthday card and gave it to me at breakfast. I remember it was a kind of collage, full of cut-out pictures of circus life, with clowns and acrobats and jugglers and horses and elephants, of course, lots of elephants. I put it up on the mantelpiece behind Pappy's photograph before we went off to school that morning. When we got home in the evening, Muddy wasn't there. This didn't surprise us. We had gotten used to her being home late these days. But on this particular evening, she was even later than usual. I was beginning to get a little worried when I heard the garden gate squeaking open. Then Muddy was calling to us from the garden. She was coming in through the back way. I thought it was a bit strange, but did not think anything more about it. I was just relieved she was home. She came in the back door, stamping the snow off her boots. She was carrying a sack over her shoulders. Potatoes, she said, dumping the sack on the floor and sitting herself down heavily at the kitchen table. She was breathless and glowing from the cold, and happy too, as happy as I had seen her in a long time. I shall make a potato soup for your birthday, Elizabeth, with a little ham. I have a little ham left. I shall make you the best potato soup a mother ever made for her daughter, and I have a present for you. A surprise. A surprise, I said. Of course, she laughed. You can hardly have a birthday without a surprise, can you? And I promise you it'll be the biggest surprise you ever had, too. It's outside in the garden. I think it is maybe a little bit too big to bring inside. Carly got to the window before I did, which irritated me because, to my mind, this was my birthday, my surprise, not his. I pushed him out of the way. I could see it was still snowing outside, but at first I could see very little else. By now Carly had rushed to the back door and opened it. "There's an elephant in the garden, Muddy," he cried. "Why is there an elephant in our garden?" Then I saw her too, a huge shadow that moved and became an elephant, as it came towards me into the light from the window. Muddy had her arms around me and was kissing the top of my head. "My secret, remember," she whispered. "Happy birthday, Elizabeth." "It's Marlene," cried Carly, leaping up and down in delight. "Is that really her?" I said. I was still not sure whether my eyes were deceiving me or not. It took a while to persuade the air director, but in the end I managed it, Muddy told me. I told him the truth, that if anything happened to her, it would break Carly's heart. And I also convinced him that Marlene needed me night and day now, that without her mother, she might as well just pine away and die of sadness. I had to be there with her all the time. And that is true, quite true, I'm sure of it. Even better, I got him to promise me that Marlene will be spared if the other animals have to be shot, if the bombers come. She might be big, I told him, but she is still only young, gentle as a kitten, and no danger to anyone. He was not at all easy to persuade, but as you know, I can be very insistent. From now on, Marlene will be coming home with me from the zoo every evening, and I shall take her back to the zoo in the morning. We shall not let her out of our sight. She lives with us, like one of our family. So, for your birthday, Elizabeth, you have a new little sister. Well, a big sister, I suppose. And she's my sister, too, cried Carly, beside himself with excitement. I remember the exact words he used. Wunderbar. Wonderful. Excellent. I had no words. I think I was still too amazed to think of any. Tonight, Muddy went on, we will all have potatoes. Marlene loves to eat potatoes. She loves to be hand-fed, doesn't she, Carly, remember? And now we can all do that, can't we? She eats lots of potatoes, but the good thing is that she doesn't seem to mind eating the half-bad potatoes, the ones people won't eat. So as we ate our steaming potato soup that night, Marlene eyed us through the window, the end of her trunk exploring the glass. Afterwards, we went outside in the snow, and Carly reached up and took her by the trunk and led her into the woodshed, which was half empty, so there was plenty of room for her to shelter inside from the snow. He stood beside her, stroking her ear and feeding her potatoes as if he'd been doing it all his life, talking to her all the while. And Marlene talked back, too, in her own way. No, she did, really. Groaning and grunting and rubbling, she had a whole language of her own. I held the lamp for Muddy as she shook out some straw around Marlene's feet. But I did keep my distance from Marlene. Maybe it was because she was just so huge to be near to. She seemed much bigger somehow in our woodshed than she had back in the zoo. But I think I was nervous also because she had a way of looking at me that I found quite uncomfortable at first. She wasn't looking at me so much as right into me. So I knew she must be able to see the lingering jealousy I was still feeling about her and Carly. But then I began to understand that she wasn't judging me. No one had ever gazed into my eyes quite like this before. I can only describe it as a look full of curiosity, kindness, and love. Any lingering resentment I might have had still been harboring against Marlene vanished during that first night in the woodshed. When we heard the wolves howling from the zoo in the distance, and she began to look unsettled and anxious, I reached down and stroked her trunk to comfort her and to show her that whatever she felt about me, I felt the same. I remember Carly looking up at me in the shed and saying, "Now I have two sisters, one with a long nose and one with a shorter one. Well, only a little shorter." I will not tell you what I said to him, but it was not polite. Neither Carly nor I slept much that night at all. We knelt side by the window looking out at the woodshed. All we could see of Marlene was a dark bulk of inside the shed, and then, just occasionally, her trunk would reach out into the snowy night. "She's catching snowflakes, isn't she?" Carly said. We were the kind of family who generally kept to generally kept ourselves to ourselves. We liked it that way, and as Pappy had often said, in those times it was safer that way too. Always best not to draw attention to ourselves. So until now, our neighbors down the street had taken very little notice of us. But the next morning, all that changed. There was a startled face at almost every window in the street as we walked out of the back gate and into the park. Muddy leading the elephant by the trunk on their way to the zoo, and Carly and I, satchels on our backs, tramping along behind them through the snow, taking the shortcut to school. Some of our school friends who saw us now joined us in the park, dozens of them, until there was a whole cavalcade following along behind, all of them full of questions and high with excitement. When we came to the parting of the ways, we all stood and watched Muddy and Marlene walking away through the trees in the direction of the zoo before running off down the hill to the school. That day at school, no one talked about the Red Army or about the war. We all had something else to talk about. Marlene, we soon discovered, had made Carly and me famous overnight. I remember how important it made me feel to be surrounded by a crowd of admirers. It wasn't a feeling I had experienced that much before, and I liked it. And I could see in playtime that Carly was also enjoying the limelight as much as I was. With what his juggling and all his other fancy tricks, he was more used to being the center of attention than I was. No one called him Pegleg anymore, I noticed. He was Elephant Boy now, and that was fine by him. That evening we threw snowballs at one another and larked about and laughed all the way home.